Hello everyone, this is Richard Cowling here from Cape St. Francis in the eastern part of the Cape Floristic region of South Africa. I'm going to be talking in this presentation about the amazing behavior of dune thicket trees. We only have to look at this incredibly shaped trunk of this white milkwood tree near Still Bay to realize that there must be some story in this topic. The behavior of trees is reflected in their architecture or the way in which they grow. And in this paper, we're going to reflect, or this presentation, should I say, we're going to reflect on some research done by my PhD student, Tion Stradum, with co-supervisors being myself, Tineke Kraai, and Adrian Grobler. So there is quite a bit of data that underpins what we're going to say, but a lot of it is also based on my observations over decades in walking around dune thicket, particularly here in Cape St. Francis. This slide provides some landscape level context for the plants that I'm going to be talking about. We're looking at a dune landscape with parallel dune ridges, in our case running east-west, and the soils, or should I say the dunes, are relatively recent. They were probably deposited in the last 6,000 years or so. We call them Holocene dunes, really the youngest features in the entire Cape landscape. In terms of geological age. And the distribution of thicket is determined by an interaction between soil moisture and fire exposure. So if we look at A, the first layer of thicket that we see in this dune landscape, we can see that it's nestled in a very steep walled dune swale. This means that the site is not subject to fire because the narrow walls of that dune swale prevent fire from getting in. Another important point is this swale is quite close to the sea, which means that the bedrock, in this case Table Mountain sandstone, is close to the surface, which means that the water table is also not that far from the surface, and these plants have access to high amounts of moisture. So in that environment, we get thicket forest, and in that community, real trees grow, like this tree we see marked B here, which is, I think, Cainanthus foveolatus, which always grows as a tree in these dune landscapes. The next swale we see, indicated by C there, is in a much broader, the swale is much broader, so the thicket gets exposed to occasional fires. It's also drier because we are further away from the sea, and the amount of sand overlying the impermeable bedrock is much greater, so plants have less access to moisture. And here we find mesic thicket dominated by these multi-stemmed shrubs, which are indicative of the fact that fires probably sweep through here perhaps once a century or thereabouts. Then, indicated by D up on the very well-drained slope, we have xeric thicket mixed up with fynbos. And xeric thicket is a low formation comprising these densely branched, what I'll explain later as hedge formers, much lower, exposed, the vegetation is low, it's exposed to fire regularly, probably once every couple of decades or so. And of course, being on an extremely or relatively high dune, the water table is a great distance below the rooting depth of the plants, so the area is much drier than either of the other sites. What I'm going to be doing now, certainly in the next few slides, is describe the above ground architecture of thicket plants. And we can identify three distinct architectures that these plants adopt. I want to stress, however, that all of the woody plants in thicket, certainly the canopy species, are capable of adopting what you might call a typical tree architecture. They're found in tree books. Somewhere the context for that plant is such that they grow as trees. But these hedge formers mostly appear as low plants, about 1 to 3 meters high, extremely densely branched, with a very dense canopy that intercepts most light as well as most rainfall. The rainfall gets down to the roots of these plants via stem flow. The plants are much broader than high. In other words, they can extend for several meters, whereas where the plant is only a meter high. Hedge formers are most conspicuous in xeric thicket, the drier thicket on the really well-drained soils, or in very dry conditions in the dune landscape, or else they appear in the early post-fire succession phase of mesic thicket. The next architecture are lateral spreaders. Lateral spreaders are multi-stem trees that can grow up to maybe 8 meters tall. They have canopies that have similar lateral and vertical extent. In other words, they grow outwards as well as upwards. And the vertical extent is, or how high they are, is often more or less approximate to how wide they are. The branches of these plants writhe and roll through the canopy, foraging for light. Sometimes they reach the ground. The canopy is much more open than the case of hedge formers, so you do get some sort of understory underneath lateral spreaders, and they dominate in mesic thicket, which occurs in wetter sites and sites that are not exposed to regular fire. Then the final growth form or architecture is what we would call typical trees, vertical grows. These are plants that grow upward. They have one or few stems. They are much, much taller than wide. And for many of these plants, certainly the ones that we find in forest thicket or in true forests, there's no plasticity. I'll explain what I mean about that later. In other words, they can only grow as trees. They can't grow as lateral spreaders or hedge formers. And they typically dominate in areas that are moist and fire protected in the dune landscape. The thicket trees, other than the true trees, the vertical growers, which seldom, which show no plasticity, but other thicket trees, the vast bulk of them, show enormous plasticity. In other words, the architecture they adopt is dependent on the context in which they grow. For example, Sideroxylon inermi, the white milkwood, can grow as a very small shrub on the coast where it's subject to fierce salt-laden winds. It can form a hedge with other species in xeric thicket and in post-fire successional mesic thicket. In mesic thicket, it can grow as a lateral spreader, as we see it here, with the branches spreading out, ever seeking some hole in the canopy or some place to forage for light. And in areas that are protected from fire and that are moist, it can grow as a true tree. So milkwood shows incredible plasticity. It does not have a deterministic growth form. It doesn't have a set of genes that say you are going to be a tree, and if you're in an environment where trees can't grow, you're not going to survive. Depending on the environment, certain genes are likely switched on or off, and thicket can adopt, milkwood can adopt different architectures. Another example of plasticity is the Kershote, Pterocelastris tricuspidatus. In the first slide, we see it growing in a hedge, as a hedge plant. The second slide, we see it as a lateral spreader. This is an interesting site in the Tsitsikamma coast, which has been probably protected from fire forever, but too dry for the plant to adopt a vertical architecture. And we can see how those stems are creeping along the ground, ever foraging for light. And here is Kershote growing as a vertical grower. Still a good sprouter. You can see it's made lots of other stems, but all those stems are going upward, not outward, because of the context, in this case of forest, in which the plant is growing. Next, we explore the underground architecture of the three different growth forms or architectural types that I've just described. We start off with hedge formers, and the important point with these plants is that they have more biomass underground, more biomass of branches underground than they have above ground. The underground branches can spread for hundreds of meters, and often what one would think would be many, many different individuals of, say, a particular hedge former, they're all actually linked in a single system, forming a giant clone. Next are the lateral spreaders. This architecture also has extensive underground stems, but not as extensive as the lateral formers. These may spread up to tens of meters, and generally the underground biomass is more or less the same as the above ground biomass. And then finally, the vertical growers. There, the underground stem spread is very restricted. Many species don't have any underground branches at all. And the underground biomass is very much less than the above ground biomass of shoots. So basically, we have hedge formers, which really are mainly underground trees, lateral formers where there's as much underground tree as there is above ground, and finally vertical growers, which behave like normal trees, which have most of their branches, in fact nearly all of their branches, above ground. All thicket trees, whether they're hedge formers, lateral spreaders, or vertical growers, can sprout after fire, and presumably after defoliation by herbivores as well. They sprout different amounts. I mean, some species are very vigorous sprouters, others are less vigorous sprouters, but that doesn't seem to be associated with the architecture. So you can have hedge formers, not many, but perhaps one or two that are not very vigorous sprouters, and you can have vertical growers that can be vigorous sprouters. If we look at the hedge formers on the top three slides, we have to also bear in mind these extensive underground stems they have. So the amount of sprouting that a single individual, in other words, a sexual individual, the amount of sprouting it does is a huge amount if you add all the sprouting across all of the extent of underground branches that hedge formers have. Lateral spreaders also, as I said, will sprout. There's quite a lot of variation. For example, Pterosalastris and Sideroxylon are quite vigorous lateral spreaders, whereas Mistroxylon and Sidrax are much they're much less vigorous. Just something I failed to point out, that where there are two slides next to each other for a single species, the first one shows sprouting after about a month, and the second one shows sprouting after about 18 months. And then vertical growers also sprout, like Xanthoxylum, Apodytes, Chionanthus, Foveolata. On average, they sprout less than lateral spreaders and hedge formers, but we also have to bear in mind that their sprouts are pretty much restricted to the area where the main stem is. So if you had to look at the amount of sprouting per genetically determined or a sexually differentiated individual, it would be considerably less than lateral spreaders, and of course enormously less than hedge formers. What we're going to do now is look at the development of thicket post-fire and track the cover or abundance of different architectural types in that successional process. So immediately after a fire that has managed to burn all the above ground parts of all plants, immediately after that fire, space is taken up by rapidly sprouting hedge forming plants. These are sprouting from numerous shoots distributed all the way across their extensive underground branches. So they are very rapidly taking up space, but we have to bear in mind that a single individual is having to allocate resources to lots and lots of sprouts. So the actual height that these plants can develop is, as we pointed out earlier, is relatively restricted. So given a time, maybe 20, 30 years, eventually one of the shoots or resprouts of the lateral spreaders, in this case it's Chionanthus foveolatus, Pterosalastris tricuspidatus, manages to punch through the canopy, even though it's very dense, of a hedge thicket of, in this case, two Cercia species, Glauca and Crenata. The ramets, as well as the seedlings of these lateral spreaders, are very shade tolerant and can therefore cope with that dense canopy. Then after another, say, 50 years, so probably 70, 80 years post-fire, you have the development of a mesic thicket community dominated by laterally spreading species. The remnants of the hedge thicket are associated with sort of decaying balls of fine wood that you find scattered throughout the mesic thicket. Given time, individual mesic thicket species grow larger than others. Milkwood is a classic dominant in very mature mesic thicket. Inevitably, some branches get overtopped either by other milkwoods or other species, and they are shed. Various openings in the canopy develop, and into those openings come the seedlings of true trees, species like Chionanthus, Clausina, Apodytes, and so on and so forth. And where these plants, these seedlings, can where they are exposed to light because of a temporary hole in the canopy or something like that, they rapidly grow, investing all their energy into upright growth. They rapidly pierce that canopy and overtop it and eventually become dominant, and what was once music thicket becomes true forest. Okay, to sum up, just a few points. Firstly, identifying architectural gills in dune thicket is useful. It helps us understand the dynamics of dune thicket vegetation. It helps us understand the structure of the communities. It's certainly thrown a great deal of light onto some problems which scientists found very difficult to deal with in the past. Secondly, and a very important point here, is that plasticity in these dune thicket trees is rife. Many of these plants are capable of adopting vastly different architectures, depending on the context in which they find themselves. How this mechanism works, this incredible plasticity, is not yet known, and certainly will be a subject of very interesting research. I suspect it's got a lot to do with turning on genes or turning off genes, depending on the environmental circumstances that plants find themselves in. But certainly it indicates that the determinism inherent in a much more genetically controlled architecture is not evident in many of these trees. Gills or architectural types, architectural gills compete, cooperate, and facilitate. So hedge formers are outcompeted by lateral growers. Lateral growers are outcompeted by vertical growers. But also within gills there's a great deal of cooperation. Different species seem to almost be helping each other to survive in multi-species hedges or music thickets. And of course that some of the architectural types, because of the nature of the environment they create at the soil level, facilitate the establishment of other architectural types. So it's a very complex system in terms of interactions. Research is required on below ground architecture. It's one of the big issues that we haven't put certainly nearly enough research into. And these patterns and processes are likely more general in thicket generally. So for example, inland thickets, the ones you get at Addo, what's determining the relative abundance of architectural types is probably browsing by megaherbivores, and soil moisture patterns over the landscape scales will also be interacting with the effects of megaherbivores on structuring inland thicket. Just to end off with a slide which shows a milkwood and a kershout that have actually fused. The stems of both of these plants, the above ground stems, are actually fused. Whether they're interacting physiologically or not, I'm not sure, but it's just another illustration of the wonderful mysteries that lurk in our thicket ecosystem.